What's the most ducked up story you've ever heard? NSFW. Okay. So a mother calls the fire department cause her son was in the bathroom taking a shower and he wasn't responding to anything after an hour or so. When they bust the door down they find the kid in fetal position in a pool of his own blood with a plunger sticking out his ass. Turns out the kid was ducking himself with the plunger and slipped. The plunger impaled through a good amount of organs killing him instantly. Nothing to be said, just D. I won't say my relation to the story, as I don't want my identity to be obvious. Basically, I know a 15-year-old girl who gave birth recently. It was found that the boy had Krabbe's, a fatal disease. Thus, the baby died shortly after birth. As with many diseases, Krabbe's is contained in a recessive gene. There must be 2 carriers to have a child with that disease. The girl's boyfriend isn't a carrier, though. Her dad is. And that's not the worst part. The baby is a result of 11 years of rape. He had been raping his daughter since she was 4 years old, and this information became widely known. Her aunt responded to the situation by saying, "That little whore should have kept her mouth shut instead of ruining the family's reputation." I heard about a guy in the dorms who was really into fitness. He would have those protein shakes and stuff. Apparently he then started having arsehole pain and didn't know why. Went to the doctor who informed him he had been unknowingly sodomized. Apparently his roommate would spike his protein shakes and abuse him when he was passed out. Edit. I have no idea about the origin and while it is ducked, I laugh every time I tell it. When I was in college, I lived in a really itty rundown part of a large town in Massachusetts. There were abandoned factories and railroad tracks and crack houses, and a pond nicknamed Dead Hooker Pond. Anyways, a pregnant woman was murdered several blocks from my apartment near the train tracks by someone who smashed her skull in with a hammer. They left her body, cut her unborn baby out of her, and kidnapped it. The baby was recovered, alive and alright. Jeepers creepers. Edit. True story. Here's the article. There was this taxi in my town that would offer kids ride me home from school for free. I was in 3rd or 4th grade when he started asking if I wanted a ride home. I always said no because I didn't know the person. When I was in high school, that taxi cab driver was arrested for child molestation, rape, and 2 counts of murder. Here's the best article I could find. Sadly, I grew up in Vallejo, so trying to find this article was a little difficult with all the assaults dealing with taxi drivers. And this is what happened in the town that I live in now. A young mother killed her twin daughters with a samurai sword and then tried burning the apartment down. I'm surrounded by crazy. Friend told me this one long distance couple were visiting each other for spring break and being unprepared. The guy, let's call him Andrew, is without lube for 6. The girl, Heather, suggests he use mayo. They're both so horny he goes for it. While she's visiting him, they keep using the mayo as lube for their sessions. When she goes back to school, she feels something tickling her around her crotch. During the day she has several orgasms. She tries to muffle them, but they are frequent and surprising. When she goes home to look, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong. She goes to a doctor to have it looked at. The doctor takes a peek and says, "My god, you have maggots in your V." Turns out the mayo attracted flies, which led to squirming maggots inside her, giving her orgasms. TL. Doctor and I never ate mayonnaise again. The worst story I ever heard was in my history class junior year of high school. My teacher was a war vet and one of the stupidest teachers you could choose to duck with. The teacher used to spend a lot of free time in class telling us stories and he had a few in particular that should never have been asked about. I was told by a senior to ask about the entrenchment tool story. So lo and behold, I go into class and he says someone give me a topic. I responded, and this happened. Our teacher was in a foxhole with a good buddy of his during Vietnam when they were ambushed. 2 guys came up to the foxhole and shot his buddy in the head. Teacher man responded by shooting bad guy in the stomach. And realizing he was out of bullets he grabbed an entrenchment tool, swung as hard as he could and ended up almost cutting the guy in half at the waist. There are a few missing details besides what was said but almost everyone left the classroom in tears. For some reason even though everyone is told how horrible the story it is, a kid in every class asks, TL, DR teacher told us a war story about how he cut a dude in half with a shovel. My friend used to pick up bodies for a living. Coroner's office. Got a bunch of stories from him. Grossest was probably an extremely obese man who lived in a trailer out in the desert. His neighbor, that is, person who lived closest, noticed that they hadn't seen him in a while. BTW, it's worth noting this was during the summer. They knocked on the trailer door. No answer, but awful smell. Turns out he was indeed dead. He was having stomach issues and was cranking out some butt smoothies when he was suddenly overcome with the urge to vomit. Did a 180 spin to hole in the toilet. Had a heart attack and died face down in his own puke piss and it. On top of that, he wasn't done with the rear expulsion, so that found its way out onto the floor. Well, fast forward a good handful of scorching desert summer days and cool breezy nights in what was essentially a tin can. This guy's remains were a bit worse for wear. My buddy shows up to collect the body and, after dealing with the smell, pulls his shoulders to lean the body back and off comes our dead man's face. Turns out the repeated heating and cooling was less than ideal for skin preservation. I'm told it was quite a gross experience indeed. TLDR. Man dies face down in a vomit piss cocktail and friend inadvertently ripped his face off when trying to move him. Get a run for a generic medical call with the visiting nurse on scene. We are met by the nurse outside who is visibly disturbed. She explains that inside is a senile elderly woman who is covered in bed sores. She says once you get inside you will see why she has to go to the hospital. Once inside we realize she has maggots in the bed with her. We took off her shoes, which probably hadn't been done in weeks. The shoes were soggy, by the way. Her feet were infested with maggots. She was very stubborn, and even with us telling her this, she didn't want to leave her home. We convinced her, thankfully. TLDR. Old lady had maggots in her feet. I knew a guy who went to college. He has a roommate who got his nipple pierced. One day the roommate is examining the piercing and sees a little white string coming out of the piercing. He starts to pull on it until it comes out a few inches. He decides the best thing to do is to cut it off with a pair of scissors. He ended up cutting a nerve and he passed out and it himself. I don't know if that's true, but it's a good one anyway. When I was a missionary in NC, I was meeting with a Honduran man who was describing his illegal immigration into Mexico on his way to the US. He said he was somewhere in the jungle mountains of Chiapas being brutally pursued by the Mexican immigration. You wouldn't believe how terrible Mexico is to illegal immigrants. He had been running all night. And he said he just got in the zone. Hadn't slept in days and was running while asleep, as he described it. I wouldn't know of these things. I've never experienced such extremes. He said he tripped on something and fell face first onto something soft. As he landed on it, it let out what he described as a very strange moan. Like a person. This freaked him out. Big time. He immediately scrambled back away from it until he slammed into a tree. It was like 3 AM. In the mountains in the middle of the jungle. He sat there in shock, mentally and physically, until the rising sun shed light on what it was. It was 2 naked dead bodies of a man and a woman, bloated from being out there for a while. In the sunlight he saw a village down in the valley. He ran there, found shelter with a charitable family that hid him from the authorities, and reported the murders. TLDR. Illegal immigrant came across naked, dead bodies in the mountains of Mexico. In college, my roommate had a Japanese girlfriend, so one night I wake up to the sound of them having sex. I hear him say the magic words. He says, "What? You know how Japanese girls sound?" Anyway, he repeats himself and she says, "I do not." Oh, okay. Suru, sorry for Pearl Harbor. This happened to me. I was living in Kazis, Uganda, and after having spent the day at Queen Elizabeth National Park, my roommates and I found ourselves riding back at night. Our friend and guide at the wheel of his Land Rover. On our way we passed many dead animals in the road. Birds, goats, cob, roadkill everywhere. As we got near the town, we passed what looked like a person on the side of the road. After a few moments of panicked pleading, we managed to convince the driver to return. When we arrived we discovered that it was in fact a young boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old. He appeared to have been hit by a car and left there on the side of the road to die. Furthermore, he had soiled himself and curled up into a ball. We rolled down all windows, flashed out lights on him, yelled at him, and never got any response. Suddenly, one of my roommates opened his door to grab the boy, but as soon as he did, the driver took off and he was forced back into the car. We were chastised by the driver for attempting to exit the car at night as close as we were to the DRC. He said that the whole thing could have been a trap. We tried to figure out if there was emergency medical service or police service, but we were told that these things did not exist after dark. I have never felt so helpless and worthless in all my life. To see something like that and be completely unable to do anything to help. It was the worst moment of my life. NSFL. My girlfriend once lived in Pontiac, Michigan, and I guess a lot of that area is really bad. One night she was doing dishes and heard 3 teenagers laughing, and then they walked past the window through her backyard. She rushed out to check on her puppy that was chained in the backyard. The duckers had slit the puppy's throat for no reason. Every time I think about this story, it makes me wish I could set off a doomsday device and instantly eradicate the entire human race. The girl at the coffee shop. I'm a prison guard and always see and hear ducked up stories. Some they could make multi-million-dollar horror movies out of. I was an alcoholic for 2 years and now I am on antidepressants. Most ducked up? Sigh. Probably the 45-year-old who would ejaculate in baby bottles and feed it to his 2 infant kids with their milk. Or the one who would taser his 6-year-old niece in the face and eyes to make her perform fellatio on him. All this and more on a daily basis. I've contemplated putting a gun in my mouth a few times. I work at a college bar, so I hear some great stories. The especially good ones are from the old guys that come in during dad's weekend. This one has to be my favorite. Back in my day we actually had fun in college. I remember one time when me and my frat brothers were bored and decided to shoot bow and arrows off the top of our house. At first we set up targets in the backyard and shot the arrows at them. It was entertaining for a while, but it lost its allure after the 3rd or 4th time we did it. The bow and arrow was sort of lost and forgotten for a time. Fast forward a year later, our fraternity was having a Cowboys and Indians themed party when, in my drunken stupor, I had a illuminating epiphany that I could scare the cowboys with the glory that was my bow. But I couldn't just shoot arrows. That would be too mundane. So I thought, what if I lit the arrows on fire? Brilliant as I was in my teenage years. So I got a handkerchief, wrapped it around my arrowhead, dipped it in kerosene and clambered up to the roof. I saw one of my buddies in the front lawn shooting off pistols in the front yard and let out my most magnificent OUUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUOUoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouoouo current mental state and completely missed him. I did however manage to hit a bush right next to our front porch, which promptly set the porch on fire. Needless to say, the fire department was called and our deck destroyed. My nickname was Dumbus for the better part of my sophomore year. One of my college teachers told me a story about him and his long-term girlfriend rock climbing about 5 years ago. She slipped and hit her head on a rock. I guess she hit so hard that half her brains were falling out and he basically had to decide whether to stay with her or go get help. Figuring she was going to die, he wanted to be with her and held her brains into her head. Fortunately, someone came and helped them. He has Polaroids of her after she got stitched up in the hospital and she ended up living. Some friends of mine who used to do a lot of drugs told me this story about some people from their hometown. One night, these guys were hanging out at their friend's house and decided to do some PCP. Because why not, right? So the dude whose house they are at leaves to go on a run for snacks or something. The dudes that are still there get sick of waiting, so they find a jar or peanut butter and decide to eat that while they wait for the snack guy to get back. They try to open the peanut butter but can't. It's too tight. So they keep trying to get the peanut butter open for like 30 minutes. But they can't get it open. Finally the guy whose house it was gets back with the food and tells them that it wasn't a jar of peanut butter. It was his ducking cat that they were trying to open. Someone posted a link to this on Reddit last time this topic came up. This is really ducked up. A litter 6 doll. My mom is a nurse and one of her patients was a man who botched a suicide attempt and blew most of his face off with a gun. Apparently he was adopted as a kid and later on in his life he met a woman online and started dating her, despite their large age difference. After a while they got serious and started living together. I forget how he found out, but it turns out the woman was his biological mother. She knew he was her son the entire time. When he found out, he was understandably not pleased. It's more a collection of stories. But it's easily the most ducked up thing I've ever seen on the internet, and I've seen a lot. One of my friends in high school was babysitting a family's 2 small children, 2 and 4. They came inside from a snowball fight because the little one needed a diaper change. She took him into the other room to take care of it, but ran back in when she heard a pop and screaming. The 4-year-old had put the family's cat in the microwave because he was afraid it was cold. Russian sleep experiment. Look it up. Got one about cats. There was a lady named Rosa that had a tamale cart all around the small town that we frequented for fishing. I always ate her tamales. They were amazing. Well, one day Rosa's establishment got shut down by the Department of Health. Yassi. Rosa was collecting stray cats and mixing the cat meat in with the chicken and pork to go further. TLDR. I almost certainly, unknowingly, ate cat several times. I remember the time I made up a story. It was good. I live a few towns over from an abandoned mental hospital turned condos. The hospital was built in 1878, so it was an older building. One day, they transferred this 15-year-old kid from a newer hospital in the area. He had a habit of crawling around heating ducts, and after 3 weeks in the older hospital, he disappeared. So, a little while later the staff in one of the wards noticed this horrible smell coming from inside the walls. Basically, the kid was crawling around the heating ducts, slipped, landed on the heating coils and literally roasted to death inside the wall. The staff had to cut him out of the wall, and when they pulled him out, his corpse was the consistency of jello. My godmother is from Vietnam, and she grew up in the years right after the Vietnam War. She lived on a farm with her brother, her parents, and her uncle, who was roughly her age. One day, she and her uncle were out playing at the edge of the property, and they found a shiny metal thing in the ground. He dug it out and brought it to the house so everyone could have a look at it. When everyone was about 4 feet away, and my godmother was right in front of him, about 2 feet away, he turned it over. It was a bomb from the war. He got blown to pieces in front of her at 8 years old. She received burns to about 25% of her body, and there was shrapnel in her arms, legs, stomach, face, you name it. She spent months in the hospital and still has some of the scars. The rest of her family got away with minor burns and shrapnel. Incidentally, her injuries, combined with her heritage, she was likely the product of a soldier raping a Vietnamese woman, and she ended up with blonde hair and blue eyes, resulted in her dropping out of school and coming to America some years later. TLDR. Godmother and her uncle were playing in a field in Vietnam. Found a bomb. Uncle got blown up and she got burnt and covered in shrapnel. Probably apocryphal. A pair of newlyweds went to the Philippines on their honeymoon. The bride went missing after a few days. The groom comes home alone and devastated, and figures that she is killed by muggers. Years later, he goes on a business trip to the Philippines again. The business partner has a weird taste, and invites him to a freak show. He finds his wife writhing on the stage, with no arms, no legs, and no eyes. The husband leaves the country on schedule, alone. My mom made bacon for Sunday morning breakfast, but when I got up and came to the table, my dad had eaten all of it. An otter species was declared extinct by the Japanese government. OP, you don't live in Louisiana, do you? I have a friend who claims his dad did the exact same thing, along with forcing his sons to kill kittens by smashing their heads against poles. It's all kinds of ducked up. A friend of mine, female, was in a storybook relationship with a guy for 6 years. He proposed to her one day and she went to work to think about it all day. She walked into her apartment after work ready to say yes and found him in bed with someone else. She is easily the nicest person I've ever met and a very caring person. She has never wronged him. Why this man did what he did is something I may never understand. She told me she cried for a very long time, but you probably figure that much. Edit. To anyone standing up for this man's actions, you're basically saying she deserved it. No one deserves that. My brother was at work taking it and his supervisor rushed in to take a thumper dumper, and when he plowed his ass on the seat, he landed on his ballsack. He fell off the toilet while my brother was taking it in the stall directly next to him, and his back went out and he pooped on the floor. What was worse was he fell towards my brother's side, so his head was poking up his stall. The guy ended up getting 6 months off work for this because he threw his back out pretty bad. It was a pretty terrible thing to happen to a person, as my brother refused to help clean him up a bit before he went and got help, noting how serious the injury was. By placing golden tablets in a hat and using seer stones to decipher them, Ma. Smith transcribed dictated the Book of Mormon. The father of one of my friends went to school with a guy who lived on a farm. This kid apparently was really horny one day and somehow got the idea to take one of those machines farmers use to milk cows and attach it to his D. He had all of the blood in his body sucked through the cow milker and died a horrible death. It was his father that found him later on. I can't think of a worse feeling than having all of the blood in your body sucked from your D as you try to pry off the device. Other than being his father finding your kid naked in the barn dead with a cow milker attached to his D. A friend of mine used to work in a mental hospital and they had to put this woman in a straitjacket in a padded room. She dislocated her shoulder, got out of the straitjacket, stripped down it in a corner, and started fingering herself with her own it as lubricant. When I was in 5th grade, my index finger was cut deep and I could see my bone and the little cut nerves. Looked cool.